Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission here is pretty straightforward. We take source material, pull out the key insights, and basically give you a shortcut to being well-informed.
And today, we're diving into a really fascinating account. It's a source describing a specific live TV interview.
Right. Between the then newly inaugurated Vice President JD Vance and a host, Marcus Bennett, who's known for, let's say, a sharp interviewing style.
Yeah, the source we have really focuses on the dynamics, the questions, the answers, the feeling in the room.
Exactly. So our goal is to unpack the specific account of that interview. We want to look at the key moments, the arguments, the rhetoric used by both sides, according to this source, and figure out why it might have mattered.
Okay, so let's set the scene based on this description. You've got the TV studio, the lights, the buzz. It's a big deal show. And there's this sense of anticipation because Vice President Vance is, just inaugurated, walking onto the set. The source says he came in with this quiet confidence.
But right away, the source flags some underlying tension. The host, Marcus Bennett, he's described, with a sharp tongue, maybe liberal leanings.
Right. And even though his producer supposedly promised a respectful chat, the account says Bennett's eyes kind of showed a different agenda.
So, not quite the friendly welcome.
Seems like it. The source mentions rushed pleasantries, a smile that didn't quite, reach his eyes. The crew seemed edgy.
And this detail is interesting. The source says Vance, using his Marine Corps training, felt like it could be an ambush.
Yeah, like his gut feeling, based on this account, was that the questions would be, well, loaded with hidden landmines.
Okay, so the interview starts. The first question described as wrapped in a smile. But Vance apparently notices Bennett's got this white-knuckled grip on his note cards.
Bennett starts off, the source calls it artificial sweetness, asking about Vance's, quote, remarkable journey from Trump critic to his second in command.
And Vance's response. How's that described?
Measured smile, according to the account. He doesn't get defensive. He frames it right away as something bigger than politics. Talks about the American capacity for growth and understanding.
So tackling it head on, but framing it broadly.
Exactly. The source says the audience actually leaned in, maybe a bit surprised by that approach.
But Bennett pushes back quickly.
Oh, yeah. Tone shifts. Described as laced with derision. He just calls it political convenience.
Okay. And Vance.
He stays steady, apparently. Says, in America, we cherish the tradition of changing our minds when presented with new information.
Right.
Explains that when he criticized Trump years ago, he saw things through a, quote, narrow lens. But then he says he witnessed something remarkable.
Which was?
Seeing Trump's policies actually starting to help the forgotten Americans he'd written about. That's how the source puts it.
Now, here's where the source highlights a real turn, right? Vance flips the question.
He does. Directly asks Bennett, have you ever changed your mind about something important? Have you ever looked at the evidence and realized your first judgment might have been wrong?
Wow.
Yeah.
How did Bennett react, according to this account?
There was a pause. The source says it lingers a fraction too long. Then he snaps back, something like, we're here to talk about your changes, Mr. Vice President, shuffling his cards. Clearly wanted to move on.
Yeah, sounds like it. That interaction alone, as described, must have shifted the feeling in the room.
Definitely. And speaking of shifts, the source says Bennett then pivots. He brings up Vance's speech at the National Prayer Breakfast.
Okay, what about it?
He questions Vance's comments on divine guidance in government decisions, asking if that's a dangerous mix of church and state.
Ooh, tricky ground. How's the audience reaction described?
The source says they tensed up like Bennett had stepped onto sacred ground.
And Vance's response?
He leans forward, clarifies. Says he was talking about the Founding Fathers understanding the need for moral guidance and leadership. Not afraid of faith, but afraid of tyranny.
So drawing a distinction.
Right. And the source notes a ripple of amen from the audience then.
He has more context too, doesn't he?
Yeah.
About the oath.
Yeah, Ressa mentions putting his hand on the Bible like leaders throughout history. Says it's not about state religion, but acknowledging rights come from God, not merely from government. And then he brings in his military background. Says nobody questioned chaplains or prayer before missions because in those moments of truth, people understood there was something deeper than politics.
That personal angle adds weight, according to the source's description.
It does. It frames his view on faith as grounded in experience, not just politics.
Okay, so how does Bennett follow up? The source mentions his face was flushed.
Yeah, apparently. He moves on to Vance's relationship with President Trump. He asks about Vance calling Trump God's instrument for America's renewal, calling that label a bit extreme.
And Vance's comeback.
Calmly, the account says. He counters that what he finds extreme is how some in the media seem more concerned about a leader who prays than about policies that hurt American families.
Oof. That's a direct shot at the media focus.
Totally. And then he pivots again, says, since Bennett brought up the president, maybe they should talk results instead of rhetoric, discuss what's actually happening since the inauguration.
How did that land?
The source describes a remarkable quiet in the studio. Like, even Bennett's usual quick comebacks paused for a moment. Vance's steady demeanor, as it's depicted, seemed to be having an effect.
Right.
The source notes Bennett's composure starting to fray a bit here. He shifts again, bringing up Vance's background.
Humble beginnings.
Yeah, contrasting it with being in the halls of power now suggests maybe he's forgotten where you came from.
How does Vance handle that?
Evenly, according to the text. Says where he comes from, people are judged by character, not by how well they fit into the Washington elite's expectations.
Character.
Yeah.
But Bennett jumps on that word.
He scoffs, yeah. Links character directly to what he calls the complete reversal on Trump, mentioning Vance's past criticisms. And Vance fires back that actually it takes more character to admit when you're wrong and stand up for what you believe in, even if people like Bennett twist it. The source mentions audience murmurs of agreement there.
The tension is really building in this description. What comes next?
Bennett, described now as tugging at his collar, questions the irony. Vance, in an expensive suit, defending a billionaire but claiming to represent working folks.
Ah, the man of the people versus suit angle.
Exactly. The source says the temperature seemed to drop.
And Vance's reaction.
Still unchanged expression, the account says. He basically implies Bennett thinks a suit changes your values. Says his Middletown, Ohio values don't change with his ZIP code or your job title.
Strong rebuttal. But Bennett keeps pushing.
Hard. Asks if it's all just political ambition. Asks if people should just ignore the past criticisms and accept he's now Trump's. While he uses the word puppet.
Puppet, wow. How is that moment described?
Like a thrown gauntlet. The source says the audience gasped. A real escalation.
Okay, this feels like a critical point. Vance's response.
Described as delivered with the precision of a master chess player. He says the word puppet reveals more about you than it does about me.
Turning it back again.
Right. Suggests maybe in Bennett's world, strong loyalty to someone you respect is something to mock. Contrasts it with his Marine experience, judging character by actions, not by what the media says.
And he defends Trump's character directly.
Yeah, says he's seen it firsthand, not the caricature he feels the media, including Bennett, creates, calls it recognizing true leadership, and states he's proud to serve alongside President Trump.
And the audience reaction to that?
According to the source, they erupted into applause, a significant moment in the dynamic.
Bennett must be feeling the pressure now. What does the source say he does?
His voice is described as dripping with sarcasm. He questions how a man of Vance's intellectual background can't see the contradiction.
Intellectual angle again.
Yep. And Vance replies calmly that Bennett is so focused on finding contradictions that you're missing the point entirely. He says the real contradiction is ignoring what I've seen with my own eyes just to please critics like yourself.
And that got a reaction.
Thunderous applause, the source says.
Vance keeps going on this point, right? About wisdom.
He does. Add something like, since Bennett brought up his background, true wisdom isn't measured by how many contradictions you can find, but by the strength to learn and grow.
And then he takes it directly to Bennett's own work.
Right. He asks, why don't we talk about the intellectual dishonesty in your coverage of this administration, Marcus?
Oh, calling him out by name and accusing his coverage.
Yeah.
How does Bennett handle that?
Sharply, apparently. Tone edged with accusation. Just says, my coverage.
And Vance presses it.
Yeah, brings up a specific segment from the week before where Bennett questioned his faith, suggesting it was just convenient election season Christianity.
It's a very direct accusation.
Very. Bennett's face reddens, according to the source. Claims he was just pointing out the timing.
But Vance cuts him off.
Yep. Asks what timing? Attending the same church before politics. Or maybe Bennett wants to question his grandmother's faith too.
Making it personal and broadening the implication.
Exactly. He says, according to the source, Bennett can question his politics fine, but suggesting his faith is fake attacks every American who holds their faith dear. The source even mentions a woman nodding vigorously in the audience.
He doesn't stop there, does he? Brings up another Bennett comment.
No, he keeps going. References Bennett saying support for traditional values means living in the past.
Okay.
Then asks Bennett directly, are the millions of Americans who go to church, believe in family, love their country, are they all just living in the past?
What's the reaction described then?
A defining silence just hangs there in the studio.
Bennett must be scrambling.
The source says he's fumbling with papers, stammers something like, Mr. Vice President, you're trying to turn this interview around.
And Vance's reply.
Steady again. No, Marcus, I'm trying to have an honest conversation about the contempt you and your colleagues seem to have for regular Americans.
Whoa. Contempt. That's strong.
Very. He suggests Bennett's real goal was to shame him and that it actually bothers Bennett that someone from Vance's background with his education doesn't fit Bennett's worldview.
That he doesn't play the expected role.
Right. That he can be Yale educated and hold traditional values. And, maybe most annoyingly for Bennett, that he can see right through the game you're playing.
Does he give examples of this game or contempt?
He does, according to the source. Points to Bennett rolling his eyes earlier when prayer was mentioned, or mockingly calling Vance's hometown Trump country on his show.
Making it about respect, not just politics.
Precisely. Respect for faith, values, and Americans who don't need Bennett's approval.
How's Bennett described at this point? This sounds intense.
Face drained of color, glancing at his producer, the producer's watching with concern and fascination. The interview, as depicted, is clearly off the rails from Bennett's perspective.
So Bennett tries to wrap it up, checks his watch.
Yeah, tries to move on. But Vance calls him out on that too. Notes it happens ever since we started talking about faith and values, calling it uncomfortable territory for Bennett.
Getting a laugh from the audience, the source said.
Few chuckles, yeah. Vance then jabs a bit, saying, for someone known for hard-hitting journalism, Bennett seems remarkably eager to change the subject when it's not going his way.
So Bennett makes one last try.
One last attempt to frame Vance's responses as deflection, linking back to the past criticisms.
But Vance brings it back to his own question.
Calmly returns to it. Has Bennett ever changed his mind about someone after knowing them personally, seeing their true character beyond media narratives? The source even notes an audience member shouting encouragement to Vance.
And then Vance addresses the audience directly. This is a major shift described.
Huge shift. Turns away from Bennett, tells the audience the real story isn't his past views or current job.
What is it then, in his view?
It's something that terrifies critics. Someone who can think for themselves, change their mind based on direct experience, and stand firm, despite relentless media attacks.
He's basically narrating what he sees as the underlying dynamic.
Exactly. Says he's just holding up a mirror to Bennett, exposing Bennett's own prejudices. Argues, true integrity isn't about never changing your mind. It's about having the courage to admit when you're wrong.
In a reaction to that.
Loudest applause yet, the source says. Even some production crew nodding along. Vance then gives his rationale for changing his mind on Trump. Says he had a choice. Stick with preconceptions or judge based on actions and genuine love for this country. He chose truth over pride.
Wow. And he finishes by speaking directly to the audience again.
Yeah, a direct address.
Yeah.
Says Americans are tired of being looked down on for faith, mocked for values, tired of journalists telling them what to think.
A call to solidarity, almost.
Pretty much. Tells people ridiculed for their faith or values to stand strong, because character is about staying true to what you believe in.
And the final scene, as described in the source.
Vance walks off. Audience gives a standing ovation so loud, the source says it seemed to shake the studio. Bennett is just sitting there, stunned silence, looking completely deflated.
The ambush, as the source framed it initially, completely backfired.
Utterly dismantled is the phrase used. The source concludes by saying it shows sometimes the best response to arrogance is dignity, and the strongest answer to bias is truth. It really highlights that power dynamic flipping entirely.
Absolutely. This account gives us, well, a ringside seat to a very specific, very intense kind of public exchange. It went way beyond just policy.
Yeah, it became, as described here, a clash over really fundamental ideas. Integrity, change, faith, respect, how different groups see each other.
It's a detailed look at how one person, in this described scenario, used their personal narrative and a direct connection with the audience to navigate what started as potentially a very hostile interview. Wow, what a detailed and compelling exchange is laid out in this source material. We've just done our deep dive into this specific account of the interview between Vice President Vance and host Marcus Bennett. We looked at the questions, the counter questions, those moments where the dynamic, according to the source, shifted so dramatically.
Yeah, we traced how the conversation, based on this account, went from Vance's political journey to faith, to values, character, integrity, ending with that direct address to the audience.
It definitely makes you think about how these public debates happen and how differently people frame concepts like consistency or loyalty or even personal growth, especially when the heat is on. So here's something to consider. Based purely on this account, what does this exchange suggest about the line between debating someone's ideas versus judging the person themselves?